Welcome to everyone who has signed on. My name is Jane Porter and I will be the moderator for the webinar today. Please take a look at the instructions on the screen and we'll just get started in 1 minute. There are several people who are just starting to log on. Bienvenue à tous ceux qui se sont inscrits. Je suis Jane Porter, la modératrice du webinaire aujourd'hui. Veuillez consulter les instructions à l'écran et nous allons commencer dans 1 minute. Merci. Okay, we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar by Environment and Climate Change Canada. My name is Jane Porter and I will be your moderator today. Thank you for taking the time to participate. Bienvenue à ce webinaire organisé par Environnement et Changement Climatique Canada. Je m'appelle Jane Porter et je serai votre modératrice aujourd'hui. Merci à tous d'avoir pris le temps de participer. Les diapositives seront dans les 2 langues aujourd'hui et nous vous répondrons dans la même langue que la question. So we will have slides in both languages today and we will answer your questions in the language in which it is posed. We will also respond to questions in the chat in French, and so if there are any questions or clarification, if you'd like us to repeat anything in French, please advise using the chat box and we will do our best. Nous répondrons également aux questions en français dans la boîte de dialogue au besoin. Si vous voulez une clarification ou désirez faire répéter quelque chose en français, veuillez nous le demander dans la boîte de dialogue et nous ferons de notre mieux pour le faire. This session will be recorded today, and for those who cannot join, you can see the link in terms of where you can find that. Cette séance sera enregistrée afin de la partager avec ceux qui ne peuvent pas se joindre à nous aujourd'hui. If you have any technical questions at all, please send a direct message to tech support and we'll try our best to handle that. Pour toute question technique, veuillez envoyer directement un message au soutien technique. For today, we'll have a mix of presentations and Q&A throughout the next hour. Please use the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel to type in your question or comment and view those posed by other participants. Use the upvote button if you agree with a question. Nous aurons plusieurs présentations et périodes de questions au cours de la prochaine 1 heure. Veuillez utiliser la touche Q&A sur le panneau de contrôle de Zoom pour taper votre question ou commentaire et voir celle des autres participants. Utilisez la touche upvote si vous approuvez une question ou un commentaire. Comme notre temps est restreint, cette fonction nous aidera à nous concentrer sur les questions qui intéressent le plus grand nombre de participants. Après le webinaire, nous passerons en revue les questions et réponses et ferons un résumé de cette rétroaction pour Environnement et Changement Climatique Canada. So in terms of using the upvotes, that will help us direct the questions in terms of what you're most interested in. Also note that we'll be reviewing the whole Q&A after the webinar and summarizing this input for Environment and Climate Change Canada. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Danny for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Jane. Bon après-midi tout le monde. Ça nous fait plaisir encore une fois de vous accueillir pour cette conversation aujourd'hui qui va avoir un focus sur les produits de plastique à usage unique. We have received very rich input and perspective and questions from last week. So we're looking forward today to continue that conversation, which will focus on single-use plastics items. I want to say that you've kept the team very busy with the input and perspective we received last week. So on this, I don't want to spend too much time. What I just wanted to tell today is we're looking forward for that ongoing conversation. So we see today being the continuation of last week rather than a totally new conversation. Alors, je vous remercie beaucoup et puis je te redonne la parole, Jane. Merci.
Merci, Danny. Next slide. Just to say a little bit about who we are. So I already said I'm Jane Porter. I'll be the moderator. Danny Dwayne will be providing opening and closing remarks. And then I'll pass it over to Shannon Castellerin, who's the manager of Plastics and Marine Litter Division, la gestionnaire division des plastiques et des déchets marins. Alors Shannon, I'd like to take it away from here.
Great. Hi, Jane. Before we start, I will just do a quick sound check. Can you see and hear me okay?
I think we're good. Thanks, Shannon.
All right, perfect. Okay, well, welcome everyone. So this is our second webinar on our integrated management approach to plastic products that was outlined in the discussion paper we published in October. So on this slide, we have our table of contents where we provide an overview of what we'd like to discuss today. So Danny mentioned we did receive a lot of comments, which we thank you for. And so I would like to recap some of the key points and the themes that did come through as a result of webinar 1 from last week. So in addition, I'd also like to discuss our management framework in more detail with an emphasis on the key themes, such as the scope of single-use plastics, sources of data that we're using, as well as some innovative solutions to be considered moving forward. I'd also like to note that these themes, again, are reflective of some of the comments we received last week, and we are really hoping to continue that dialogue by addressing them today. And lastly, before we continue, I would also like to touch upon some process-related items, such as our key timelines and next steps, and at which point we will pause and provide an opportunity for questions. So next slide. Donc, le but de la discussion d'aujourd'hui est d'examiner de plus près les 2 premières étapes de notre cadre de gestion pour les plastiques à usage unique, qui catégorise les plastiques à usage unique en fonction d'un ensemble de critères et fixe des objectifs de gestion. Les critères dont nous discuterons sont problématiques sur le plan environnemental et problématiques sur le plan de la récupération de la valeur. Au cours de la discussion, je voudrais expliquer ce qu'on entend par ces termes. J'aimerais également consacrer un peu de temps sur les sources de données qui ont été utilisées pour aider à définir ces termes et à établir la liste des articles à l'usage unique. Je vais passer un peu de temps à discuter aussi des résultats des 6 articles à l'usage unique qui répondaient à la fois aux critères problématiques sur le plan environnemental et de la récupération de la valeur. J'aimerais aussi aborder la question des bouteilles d'eau qui a suscité un intérêt considérable de la part des intervenants. Et à la fin de cet webinaire, nous espérons obtenir vos commentaires sur les idées présentées aujourd'hui, car ces commentaires sont importants pour renforcer notre cadre de gestion ainsi que pour préparer le terrain pour les futurs webinaires. So next slide. So this slide provides a recap of webinar 1 and speaks to our comprehensive approach to managing plastics. So a few key takeaway points. The first is that we all have a role to play in achieving zero plastic waste. Another key point that's presented here is that Canada's been involved in a number of international and domestic initiatives to achieve zero plastic waste. And the main events are listed here on the slide, and they include our Ocean Plastics Charter, the Canada-wide Strategy on Zero Plastic Waste, which is a federal, provincial, territorial initiative, and the Federal Comprehensive Agenda on Plastics. Another key highlight that's also noted here are our recent publications. So in October, we published the Science Assessment of Plastic Pollution, as well as our next steps in achieving zero plastic waste. So these include the proposed order to add plastic manufactured items to Schedule 1 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and our discussion paper on an integrated management approach to plastic products to prevent waste and pollution, which is the basis of our discussion today. So if we move to the next slide, this slide provides an overview of the management framework, which is a 3-step process that includes categorizing single-use plastics, setting management objectives, and then choosing the right risk management instrument. In the first step, which is to categorize single-use plastics, the 2 main criteria used are whether or not a given item is environmentally problematic, value recovery problematic, or both. So I'll start with environmentally problematic, which has 2 subcomponents. So these are whether or not a single-use item causes environmental harm, or if it is prevalent in the environment. So on the area of environmental harm, we do get our indicators and our cues from the science assessment. So the science assessment describes environmental harm from single-use plastics as being physical harm to marine life that occurs from either ingestion or entanglement. It also notes that harm can come from other impacts, such as overall impacts to the functioning of an ecosystem, including impacts to its biodiversity and even habitat integrity. So the second point I'd also like to talk about is prevalence in the environment. So this really refers to the amount of a particular single-use item in the environment. And the metric we use to measure this prevalence is the frequency that this item is often found in our shoreline and litter cleanups. So the science assessment does speak to the prevalence of single-use plastics along shorelines, both in Canada and internationally. It also lists some of the most common single-use items, and these are some of the items that we'll be looking at today. Now, the other criterion I'd like to touch on is value recovery problematic. And this is a criterion that's used to look at how effectively an item can be recycled. So things considered include the recycling rate of an item, its compatibility with recycling and waste treatment systems, and in particular, whether or not it hampers these systems. Value recovery problematic also occurs, considers whether or not there are barriers to increasing recycling rates. And these barriers could be for a number of reasons, such as the fact that the item isn't collected through curbside collection programs. And I would like to just note that these subcomponents, they do, particularly in the area of value recovery, they do align with some international initiatives, such as the United Kingdom's Plastic Pact and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And in particular, one of the ways that the United Kingdom Plastic Pact actually finds problematic plastics is by the very notion or the fact that they are not recyclable, or there's hampering, or that they hamper recycling. And an interesting point in mentioning these 2 independent initiatives is that they actually go beyond recycling in the sense that they consider other end-of-life options for limiting problematic plastics, such as redesign and reuse. So once we've categorized a group of single-use items, we need to set management objectives. And these objectives will vary depending on the criteria met. So for example, for single-use plastics that are environmentally and value recovery problematic, we'll want to set more stringent objectives that will focus on eliminating or restricting their use to the extent that we can. And for items, for example, that are value recovery problematic, the risk management objectives may focus on increasing recycling, as an example. So if we move to the next slide, this slide provides a recap of the preliminary list of single-use items that we put through our management framework. And a couple of points here to note is that this is the initial list of single-use items where, for example, for some items such as plastic bags, they're grouped or nested where we see a number of different bags grouped together, such as checkout bags and garbage bags. And we did find that once we put plastic bags through the framework, that the results varied. So as we'll see in the next two slides, checkout bags, for example, were met with both environmentally problematic and the value recovery problematic criteria, whereas some of the other bags were found to be just value recovery problematic. So this next slide presents, if we move to slide 8, this next slide presents the single-use plastics that meet either the criteria being environmentally problematic or value recovery problematic. I will back up again. This slide, this is the slide where the single-use plastics are meeting both criteria. And actually, I would like to take some time to walk through each of these items. So in terms of checkout bags, we do have some peer-reviewed studies that point to checkout bags as being one of the most harmful items to wildlife. So they are responsible for many of the entanglements for sea and freshwater birds. And there's also evidence that some of the most common causes of blockages in larger animals such as whales comes from plastic bags. In terms of environmental prevalence, data from our shoreline cleanups shows a high number of plastic bags being collected each year. And even municipal audit audits have also listed bags in the top 20 items collected. So checkout bags are also value recovery problematic. So we did commission a study through ChemInfo, and it revealed that these bags often have high disposal rates and low collection rates. And the study also did note that there are barriers for recycling, such as low value, for example, for some of the post-consumer plastic that's collected. The next group that I would like to talk about are straws and stir sticks. And I do want to talk about these items together because often the data that we find does in fact have them lumped together. So both of these items can cause environmental harm as they float and can be ingested. In terms of being prevalent in the environment, a recent study looking at macroplastic pollution in freshwater environments in Europe ranked straws and stir sticks as the 10th most commonly found item. Similar to some of the carrier bags, they're highly prevalent in our shoreline cleanups and audits. And in terms of value recovery, so the earlier studies I had mentioned are the work by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the United Kingdom Plastic Pact have identified these items as being a value problematic category for plastic packaging. So the next item I'd like to talk about are 6-pack rings. So these rings cause environmental harm. And we have found studies showing they are responsible for a significant number of entanglement of sea and freshwater birds. They're also found on shoreline cleanups, although not as frequently as some of the straws and checkout bags. And they have also been identified as a problematic category for plastic packaging. Cutlery is also one where we have peer-reviewed studied on marine debris and impacts on wildlife. And these studies show that plastic cutlery is rated as one of the most harmful items. Cutlery is also prevalent in the environment, and it is also commonly found on shoreline cleanups. Cutlery was also included in the study that we commissioned through ChemInfo, and similar to some of the other items, it was found that it had a very low collection rate for recycling and a very high rate of disposal. Now, the last item I'd like to touch on is our food serviceware from problematic plastics. And I will start by indicating that problematic plastics are those that can be harmful when they get into the environment and are hard to recycle. So essentially, they're the plastics that are meeting both of the criteria we're talking about today. These include things like containers made from expanded polystyrene foam, polyvinyl chloride, oxydegradable plastic, and black plastics. So for example, expanded polystyrene foam is light, it can travel long distances, and it can fragment into smaller pieces. Oxydegradable plastics are also plastics that can fragment into smaller, more micro particles. In terms of being environmentally prevalent, these types of containers are also found along our shoreline cleanups. And our ChemInfo study also found that they have low recycling rates and high disposal rate. And as an example of some of the low recycling rates may be due to the fact that they're hard to recycle. So for example, black plastics are often not sorted by recycling facilities and as a result are sent to landfill or incinerated. So if we move to the next slide, this slide speaks to the results for the other single-use plastics that met one of the criteria, which means they were either environmentally problematic or value recovery problematic. And two of the items I would like to highlight here, given the interest that was expressed in the first webinar, are plastic bottles and cigarette filters. So bottles meet the criteria for being environmentally problematic since they cause harm if ingested and they're found on beach cleanups. However, they also have high recycling rates due to provincial and territorial deposit systems and other programs. And as a result, they're not considered to be meeting the criteria of being value recovery problematic. And so for this reason, they have not been proposed as a candidate for the ban. So the other items, cigarette filters, are one of the most commonly collected items during some of the litter audits and shoreline cleanups. And they are harmful to the environment because they do contain toxic chemicals that will enter the water and soil when they're littered. However, through the framework, it was identified that cigarette filters don't hamper recycling or wastewater treatment. And so they don't meet all the problematic criteria for value recovery. Another thing with cigarette filters is that they don't have currently readily available alternatives. And so for these reasons, they were not considered for a ban. So although these two items, along with some of the other ones on the slide, are not candidates for a ban, it doesn't preclude developing non-regulatory risk management measures under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. So if we move to the next slide, I'd just like to take a bit of a recap. So at this point, we've walked through the criteria for the management framework for single-use plastics. And I would like to address some of the other comments we received from webinar 1, which suggested that other criteria such as the environmental footprint or the life cycle analysis of a single-use item be considered. So life cycle analysis, it's an interesting approach, and it's one to model the full product life and really look at the subsequent environmental impacts. And really it takes something that's known as a cradle to grave approach to determine the total impact an item can have on the environment. And this really looks at things like the raw materials from extraction, production, consumption, transportation, and even end-of-life disposal. So life cycle analysis that can be done on an item by item basis. And the real value in this type of analysis is that it can be used to determine the environmental trade-offs between a plastic and the alternative non-plastic item that could fulfill the same need. So a couple of things on this. So greenhouse gases are one of the main environmental impacts that are considered. Other considerations include land and water impacts, air pollution, and waste management costs. And the challenge with this type of analysis is that it is often region specific. So it can be challenging to apply existing studies to a Canadian context. However, we are starting to look at life cycle analysis and some of the trade-offs between conventional plastics and their non-plastic alternatives. And I'm happy to say that we are not the only jurisdiction doing so. So Scotland recently published a consultation document on a regulatory proposal it has in place, or it's considering to restrict certain single-use plastics. And in this proposal, they're undertaking a strategic environmental assessment that compares a number of environmental impacts from plastic items and their alternatives. So some of the areas being considered include the carbon footprint, for example, of these materials, as well as the overall waste generation and amount of pollution that's entering terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And what's interesting with this study is that the alternative products to plastics, such as wood and paper, are found to be heavier than plastic and may result in more waste. However, a couple of sort of trade-offs with this are because these alternatives are considered to be low carbon materials, in comparison to the plastics they're replacing, it's anticipated there will be a reduction in overall carbon footprint. And in addition, these alternatives are also anticipated to degrade more quickly. And so it's predicted that there'll be less pollution entering the marine environment. So all this to say, life cycle analysis, it has potential, it's interesting, and it's complex. And so while we're exploring the use of it, I think it makes sense to ensure that we're doing so in a way, where it makes sense, where we're really considering sort of, information that's relevant to the Canadian context. And I also think, in terms of looking at how it could apply to our risk management framework, it could be a tool that we use perhaps when setting some risk management objectives. So just in closing on this, this is certainly an area where we welcome your feedback and comments, as well as any data that you may have that may be applicable to the Canadian context. So if we move to the next slide, this slide pertains to the scope of single-use plastics. And there were a number of comments received in webinar 1 that really tried to unpack what we're doing and really wanted to know, how are we going to define the 6 single-use plastics that are candidates for the ban? So this includes how we intend to define them, define first single use, and then how we intend to apply that definition of single use to the 6 items that are listed here. So a few of the specific areas where we received comments are listed on the slide, and they include things such as whether or not physical characteristics will be considered when scoping out the items that are candidates for the ban. And so an example of a physical characteristics, for example, could be whether or not the thickness of a plastic bag we'll use to define what a checkout bag is. Other questions received pertain to details in terms of will we be considering the type of resin or plastic in how we define some of these items. And in the case of the problematic foodware items, we have identified problematic plastics, which include those that were made from expanded polystyrene foam, polyvinyl chloride, oxo-degradable plastic, and even black plastics. There were other questions in terms also with regard to personal protective equipment or PPE and how, as an emerging issue, it fits within our integrated management approach. So this is an area where we are aware of the environmental impact from PPE that is littered, and as well as the increasing amounts that are being sent to landfills. And we are exploring options for reducing and managing PPE waste. And I will note that since the beginning of the pandemic, a number of federal programs have invested and actually continue to invest in PPE to advance technologies. So this includes investments, for example, in compostable masks. For reusable equipment, it's looking at more widespread use of sterilization techniques. And we're also seeing the development of recycling technologies to process some of the existing PPE waste to reduce the amount that will end up in the environment and in landfills. So one last theme I'd like to touch on here is the availability of alternatives. So this is where, in developing measures to ban and restrict certain single-use plastics, we will work to ensure that the items that have been identified can be replaced by readily available alternatives that serve the same function. So for example, single-use checkout bags can be replaced by both single-use alternatives like paper or reusable alternatives like canvas. Now, we do realize that differences in cost are an important factor to consider in developing regulations, and analyzing the potential impacts will be important both on Canadians as well as businesses. And this, of course, will be taken into consideration as we move forward in deciding which items to ban, and also deciding, in terms of the scope of what we put in place. This information will also be reflected in the regulatory documents that we publish, including a cost-benefit analysis, which is published alongside with our regulation. So if we move to the next slide, this slide speaks to the data sources we have used, and some of which I've already mentioned throughout this webinar. So I will recap on a few of these. So I have made reference to our science assessment of plastic pollution. And this is where the science assessment, it provides evidence that macroplastics in the environment, they do pose a threat. Plastic pollution can lead to entanglement, ingestion, habitat disruption. And this is the information that's helped frame the environmentally problematic criterion that was discussed earlier. In addition, we use litter data, and that really helps us with determining how prevalent something may be in the environment. Some sources of litter data that I had mentioned were some of the citizen science initiatives, such as the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup. And this cleanup provides large data sets that go back several years, really looking at what's being collected along Canadian beaches and shorelines. In the terrestrial environment, we've looked at some of the litter surveys and audits that have been conducted in cities such as Vancouver, Edmonton, and Toronto. We also look at academic and scientific reports and studies. So an interesting study was conducted by scientists at Memorial University, and they really looked at studying litter data and trends that ranged from the 60s right up to 2019. And this is really helpful in providing some good context in terms of the marine and shore litter data that's been found in that province. Other things we look at is our litter collection studies that are undertaken in other jurisdictions. So Pennsylvania, for example, recently published a litter research study on terrestrial litter. in their area. Other things we use, a lot of peer-reviewed articles, particularly when we're looking at observed impacts to wildlife, and many of these were in fact actually included in our science assessment. Single-use products performance at end of life. This is something that we look at, particularly when we're trying to unpack some of the collection and value recovery rates, as well as better understand existing barriers to our recycling systems. Another thing we look at too are what in fact are other jurisdictions putting in place. So this could range from what's happening in provinces and territories to some of the US states, as well as countries in the European Union that are taking action. And another thing too we look at are what are the initiatives that are underway, both industry initiatives and some of the ENGO reports, you know, to look at where, you know, who are the early actors and what are the actors and what are the things they're taking action on. So for example, earlier I mentioned the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and they actually just recently published their 2020 progress report, where they outlined not only problematic plastics, but they identified some of the early industry leaders who have been working to phase these plastics out. So all that said, we look at data from a number of sources, and this is to address a number of issues. Now, today's discussion was about the front end of our risk management or our management framework. And as you review and provide comments, if you have additional data that would pertain to our setting objectives and establishing criteria, we would definitely be happy to receive it. So I'll move to the next slide, which speaks to innovative solutions. So we've heard from stakeholders about innovative forms of plastic that may be under development or already available, and that can potentially reduce the environmental impact of plastic packaging and products, and that may even improve end-of-life outcomes. So this could include plastics that are bio-based, biodegradable, or compostable. So a couple things on these plastics. So these plastics are considered non-conventional. They often come from alternative feedstocks to sort of traditional oil and gas feedstocks, many of which are bio-based, so either agricultural or forest type products. And as a result, they may offer opportunities for different end-of-life processing, such as through composting. On the slide here today, we have two types of resins listed. These are resins that are more commonly used, so polylactic acid or PLA, and another one is PHA. So lots of initiative and work happening on these plastics. However, I do want to point out that we are also aware that currently there may be some gaps and challenges with ensuring that some of these plastics are compatible with existing municipal composting facilities. So in addition to that, we do see that it's important to foster innovation and clean growth, and these are important objectives for the Government of Canada. So we do want to make sure that these non-conventional plastics, particularly those that have the potential to improve environmental and value recovery outcomes, are given the appropriate consideration in any measure that we develop. And so really this involves ensuring that we're working with stakeholders to gather viewpoints and more evidence to really inform our understanding of these different kinds of non-conventional plastics and the potential roles that they may play. And any feedback that you will have will help us determine whether and how, you know, measures might both prevent plastic pollution as well as support in some of these innovative technologies that will ultimately improve environmental outcomes and will really help drive us to that goal of circular economy. So in the next slide, the slide I am transitioning a bit, and I do want to take some time to highlight our process. So as you can see on this slide, we have a number of webinars occurring this month, and the dates are presented here. And an important point I do want to make note of is that December 9th, which is the end of the comment period for our proposed order and discussion paper. If we move to the next slide, we'll see the list of the upcoming webinars. So a few to highlight. So next week, we have a follow-up webinar in our management framework where we'll focus on instrument selection and development. The following week, November 20th, we then will move into recycled content. And then our last webinar in November, which is November 27th, will be used to address some of the key themes that have emerged from these earlier sessions. In January, we will hold a final webinar, and this will be to discuss extended producer responsibility and to also provide a recap of some of these earlier sessions. So I'll move to our last slide, which is the last one before we break out into our discussion. And this is to reiterate a couple of points. One, again, is that we're really looking for your feedback on our integrated management approach by December 9th. And again, just to also say that this feedback is important for a number of reasons, in particular because it will help inform the design of our draft regulations. So at this point, I think I'll pause and I'll turn it back over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Merci beaucoup. Okay, so this is the Q&A part of the hour. So I will turn the first question over to Danny. So Danny, the first question, the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the essential role of some plastics in minimizing the spread of disease, but this situation has generated a lot of waste. What are you doing about this? Also, are you taking into account how the ban may affect companies that are trying to rebound from the COVID-19 crisis?
Merci, Jane. Thanks for the question. It is an extremely important one, and it's a good reflection of any products that are made of plastics or part of plastics. They are always playing an extremely essential role. At the same time, when they get into the environment, then that becomes a problematic item. So PPEs have been playing an important role in protecting Canadians in the last couple of months. They are, as I mentioned, part of plastics or all in plastics, and then when they get into the environment, it's problematic. So the ministers at the CCME were seized with that issue of increased waste from PPE, and they've agreed to work together in few areas, depending on where different authorities lie. So there's been right away a bit of information to Canadians, outreach and public education as to how to treat those items properly. Provinces and territories are responsible for the disposal and the biohazards materials, so they're also doing some work there. Shannon mentioned quite a lot of innovation that the federal government is supporting in terms of alternative materials. So that's kind of what I would say, the investment that stimulates innovation. There's also work to make sure that the results of the innovation are going to be accepted, if I can say, in the regulatory framework. So if a mask made of another material is allowed through the thinking about Health Canada regulations, for example, so they can be picked up in the market. But I think the other side, the other part of that question is actually where we're really interested. We understand that COVID has an impact on companies. There's an impact on people. So we have reviewed and revised the discussion paper as a result of the pandemic a while ago. But really, the regulatory measures we'll be developing will be influenced and informed by your comments and your suggestion and your perspective as to how how the circumstances of COVID should be reflected in the measures, voluntary or non-voluntary measures. So I do hope that we're gonna be able to work together, like all stakeholders, to get around that issue. Because as I mentioned, the PPEs are playing a very important role. At the same time, the way they are managed, end up in the environment, is then the issue we need to collectively figure out. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Next question is for Ryan Parmenter, and I apologize, we didn't introduce Ryan at the very beginning. So when he joins, I'll just ask if you can introduce yourself. A question on how will federal actions impact local government actions on plastic waste? What if they are not similar?
Thanks very much, Jane. So just to introduce myself to folks, my name is Ryan Parmenter. I'm the Director of Plastics and Marine Litter. And so I work with Danny and Shannon on the team as well too. My name just wasn't on the first slide. Not to worry. Thanks very much, Jane, for the question. I think it's a really good question. We obviously recognize that other jurisdictions in Canada are putting in place different measures to address plastic waste and pollution. And in some cases, these are prohibitions and restrictions on certain single-use items, just like checkout bags, for example. I think that's probably the most common example. So we certainly would like to move forward with an approach that avoids any conflict with provincial, territorial, or local requirements. And we continue to work very closely with the provinces in particular on discussing how these things can move forward. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think in some cases, the measures that we'll be putting forward will align very nicely with approaches that are being taken in certain jurisdictions. And maybe in some other instances, we'll have to kind of work on as to where the federal approach and the provincial approach can be adjusted to align a little bit better. So maybe I'll just close by saying, we'd welcome any input from folks from various jurisdictions on how they think an approach can kind of best align and work together to address plastic waste and pollution.
Thank you, Ryan. Next question we have here is for Shannon in regards to alternatives. What is the government doing to ensure that alternatives to single-use plastics are available?
Hi, Jane. So we do recognize that businesses need time to choose an alternative, particularly for those single-use plastics that are subject to the ban. And so this is where, through this process, we will be looking at the feedback we get from the webinar, the written submissions, and this will really help us determine what appropriate phase and times are needed to allow businesses to adapt. And again, there's a number of considerations that will be taken into account, particularly from a socioeconomic perspective. But again, I just really want to emphasize that this is where it is really important that we do hear from people. And particularly sort of now where we're in this open period for comments.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Another question for you regarding problematic plastics criteria. So people are interested in better understanding how hard to recycle plastics will be defined and assessed as it relates to food serviceware, as well as how availability of alternatives are assessed. Also, I think there are some specific comments here about polystyrene packaging is a huge challenge for many people, presenting costing many people. Anyways, I'll let you carry on with this one.
Okay, so I will start by saying, so in terms of, understanding the issue and the information that we draw upon, we do draw upon a range of available data. That's really looking at, to what extent something might be hard to recycle or you might hamper recycling systems. So we turn to studies in Canada and other jurisdictions that have really, done a bit of this work, have estimated rates for collection and recycling, as well as other value recovery activities. We also look at some of the peer review research we have, particularly around analysis on barriers to recycling. And this is where in particular we will be looking at certain plastics such as the expanded polystyrene. And just on sort of the issue of value recovery is, we recognize that problematic value recovery, it can be managed and can be changed. And so this is where, there is opportunity to sort of look at sort of existing recycling facilities to determine, look at what they're designed to do and, and what are the limits around there and how do we build the infrastructure that we're needing, that's needed to sort of move beyond some of these issues and sort of ensure that we're able to extract the value from all plastics. And so that said, again, this is sort of another point where we do welcome any available data or evidence that will really help inform sort of the analysis that we take moving forward.
Thank you, Shannon. Une question en français pour Danny. La définition de plastique comprend-elle les bioplastiques et autres polymères qui ne seraient pas de source pétrolière?
Merci Jane pour la question. Et je vais probablement répondre par une autre question. C'est un endroit où on a vraiment de l'intérêt de recevoir des propositions. On comprend que les bioplastiques, les plastiques compostables peuvent améliorer l'empreinte environnementale dans certains cas. Je vois dans le chat box, il y a aussi des vues différentes sur cette question-là aussi. Donc, en fonction en prenant un peu, en fonction des empreintes écologiques, puis la gestion en fin de vie, il pourrait définitivement en faire partie ou pas. Donc, on s'attend à avoir beaucoup d'input et de perspectives sur ce sujet-là, en particulier en termes de la définition. Est-ce que ce sont tous les bioplastiques qui devraient être à l'intérieur? Est-ce que ça devrait être des sous-composants? Donc, j'espère qu'on va être en mesure de travailler sur ça à travers les consultations puis l'input des gens. Question numéro 4 du papier de discussion couvre sur cet enjeu-là en particulier.
Merci, Danny. We have another question for Ryan related to the fishing industry. So we have a strong fishing industry in Nova Scotia. Where would the use of bait bags and lobster bans fall under the proposed management framework?
Thanks very much for this question, Jane. I think Shannon kind of nicely pointed out that the data that we had used to talk about some of these items was kind of first and foremost at the national level, along with some kind of supplemented by kind of municipal-led studies as well too. So as a result of that approach and the availability of data, those specific items for the fishing industry didn't kind of get elevated to the list of items that we were discussing. However, I think it's important to note that we are working with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans kind of to examine possible measures using our framework and taking into account work that they've already have underway on the prevention and cleanup of activities related to the fishing industry. And I know that they're working on, the federal government continues to work to promote some of those best practices on the international level. The only other thing that I might add as well to that one is that under the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment Action Plan, ministers did agree to develop collaborative approaches to address the waste from aquaculture and fisheries. Certainly that's an item and an area and an industry of interest, and we certainly would welcome kind of input on how bait bags and lobster bans could potentially best be dealt with.
Thank you, Ryan. Another question here for Danny related to business actions. Have any companies or businesses transitioned away from or banned some plastics?
Thanks, Jane. This question, we see and we're aware of many initiatives, mostly around moving away from single-use plastics or by either going to alternatives, reusable and other things, or innovation. Quite a lot of work happening on innovation to increase recyclability of product. Again, in your comment for the December 9th timeline, very useful for us to be aware of additional investments, additional action that will happen. Just recently, for example, there's an alliance that's looking at a plastic pack for Canada. Extremely useful for us to know what are the commitments under those task force. And then in the retail, when I go to do my grocery, things have changed quite a lot recently. Less and less plastics everywhere. Alternatives getting into the market. Thanks.
Question for Ryan regarding trade. How do you expect this to impact trade? Are there any NAFTA implications?
So I think it's a little bit early to speculate on the potential impacts because we're still in the consultation phase of kind of discussing the path forward of our proposed approach. But what I think we can say is that we're certainly working with Global Affairs Canada, and we're trying to take the appropriate steps in communicating with our key trading partners, both so that they continue to understand the process that we're using to develop this approach, and also the kind of the scope and measures that we're considering as well too. So I think the intent is certainly to develop an approach that respects all of Canada's trade-related obligations and work forward on that going forward. So I think that's about the best answer I can provide currently based on the state that we're in the consultation process.
Thanks, Ryan. Another question for you regarding the impacts. Consideration for exemptions, or consider the societal benefits of, should you consider the societal benefits of products?
Thanks, Jane. I think certainly their consideration does need to be given to the societal benefit of products. And I think we're kind of, the approach and the framework that we're putting forward includes an emphasis on that, particularly as it relates to whether a viable alternative exists or does not. So that's kind of touching upon, is there an alternative? Is it readily available on the marketplace? And can that alternative meet or fulfill the essential role that it's intended to do, particularly as it relates to kind of protecting health and safety, or even ensuring accessibility. So we certainly have kind of some of those thoughts and that we're kind of tracking and very interested in, but we also would really welcome folks' input on this particular item as to whether there are additional considerations that we should be looking at for an analysis for exemptions. And I just want to flag too that that's something that we're going to spend a little bit more time focusing on in the next webinar. So this is kind of a nice question that will lead into the next webinar that we're going to do. So, but any additional information on the rationale for including an additional consideration or ideas on how those kind of considerations could be incorporated into the approach would certainly help to inform the framework and our proposed approach as well too. So thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Ryan. Next question is for Shannon regarding microplastics. The science assessment determined that microplastics have the potential to cause harm to biota, and therefore efforts should be made to keep them out, of the environment. We also know that all macroplastic eventually become microplastics. Therefore, all plastic pollution is potentially harmful in the environment. I don't understand how the decision was made that hot, cold drink cups aren't environmentally harmful. Can you explain?
Thanks, Jane. So I'll start with the science assessment. So the science assessment recommended taking action to reduce plastic pollution, particularly in line with the precautionary principle. And it also recognized that we still need additional research to truly define the impacts pertaining to microplastic pollution. That said, though, we have already moved forward with a few actions on microplastics. So in 2019, our microbeads and toiletry regulations came into effect. But I do want to now sort of link that in with the comment about the hot and cold drink cups. So two of the environmental harm criteria we've discussed are prevalence in the environment and harm to wildlife. And so while these hot and cold drink cups are certainly prevalent in the environment, we're not really seeing the evidence that they affect wildlife or habitat to the extent of the impacts we're seeing for the 6 items being proposed for the ban. And another point I want to also emphasize is, our management framework, there were a number of items, and, I had kind of touched on, depending on how things are triaged, there'll be assigned different risk management objectives. And so just because in this case, these hot and cold drink cups haven't necessarily fallen in the bin of things to be banned, it doesn't mean that we're not going to take risk management action. You know, and I think that's where for many of these items, you know, that were found sort of on slide 9, you know, we have the opportunity to really look at what is the right touch for risk management and how do we want to move forward with them. And I think what's really promising is, you know, we're starting to see some industry leaders who are moving on these items. So for example, you know, we've seen announcements by Tim Hortons and Burger King, you know, and so I think this is where, you know, and it kind of speaks to some of the points raised in you know, certainly the last webinar, that everyone has a role to play. And I think we'll really see in these instances where, you know, through getting creative, that we will be able to really tap into the capacities and the capabilities, you know, of everyone, you know, who can help find a solution.
Thanks, Shannon. I think we have time for about one more or so. I think this one goes to Ryan about extended producer responsibility in the provinces. So right now, extended producer responsibility, or EPR, is very different in each province. What will happen if a management objective is set to increase recycling of an item in a province that does not have strong EPR policies? The cost could fall on municipalities. As it stands, it does not look like EPR will be regulated or required in all provinces' territories. How can we make sure the single-use plastics management objective align with strong harmonized EPR?
Thanks for that, Jane. That's a really good question. So the discussion paper certainly identifies end-of-life responsibility as a key element of the integrated approach. And that's certainly something that we're interested in and discussing. So expanding and enhancing extended producer responsibility by working with provinces and territories is certainly a priority area. And I think what we're very interested in, and it's outlined in the discussion paper, is we're looking for a kind of a consistent, comprehensive, and transparent approach. So that's certainly going to be one of our focuses moving forward. And I think we'd welcome feedback on that as well too, but also it's good to note that this is certainly a subject that we are going to address and spend some time on in a future webinar as well too. So we would certainly look forward to having kind of more in-depth discussion on that subject and hearing feedback from all folks on how the best way of maybe moving forward on that.
Great, thanks. Time for one last question. So there are a lot of questions that have come in on how we will treat bioplastics or compostable plastics. Danny provided an answer in French earlier, but I'll pass it over to Shannon to elaborate on this issue.
Thanks, Jane. So a couple things on bioplastics. So although there are a number of challenges to overcoming when using innovative plastics, like bioplastics or compostables, there is the potential for these plastics to really have a positive impact on the environment and also to improve end-of-life outcomes. And so this is where, you know, there's opportunity. So there's really opportunity to foster innovation and clean growth, you know, which are, again, important objectives across all of the Government of Canada. But this is where we really want to make sure that we do it right and that the solution we find is truly a good fit. So we make sure that these non-conventional plastics have the potential to improve environmental and value recovery outcomes, but also, you know, to ensure that there are opportunities, you know, for innovation. And this is really to ensure that we have, you know, the best outcome possible and that we really are able to transition to, again, a more circular economy.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Danny, I'll invite you to say some closing remarks and we'll close out.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Jane. Thanks, everyone. I'm always surprised when I monitor the chat, the rich intervention. So we'll continue to work with you. There are, I think we've touched upon issues today that won't be resolved without you helping us to solve them as well. So at the beginning, Shannon mentioned we all have a role to play, and I think this is exactly where those difficult issues and few others that were raised in the chat box, the Q&As, will require your concrete proposal for moving forward. So thanks again for participating in this conversation. C'est pour nous extrêmement important d'avoir les perspectives de tous les intervenants et on aurait pu attendre le 9 décembre, mais on a choisi de faire ça en même temps. Donc, les opportunités seront présentes dans les prochaines semaines et aussi le 9 décembre. Donc, merci beaucoup encore et bonne fin de semaine.
Bon. Merci beaucoup de votre temps aujourd'hui. Si vous avez d'autres questions, veuillez les envoyer à l'adresse électronique indiquée. And just a reminder as well, everything has been recorded and they will be available on we'll send you the link so that you have access to them and you'll have access to slides as well. If you're interested in signing up for the next ones, you'll be all receiving another reminder to sign up for that Eventbrite shortly. And so thank you very much for your time today and have a wonderful day. Thank you.